Hey YouTube, I'm Ross Stewart with Stewart Media Digital and welcome back. To me, I'm the one who's been missing for a while, sorry about that, but I am back and I am making new content. I have a new studio space, but it is still being set up, so for now you just get this lovely black background. Anyway, let's start talking about the lens. Today I'm reviewing the Sony G Master 50mm 1.2 prime lens for the Sony E-mount system. Now, I absolutely love the 50mm focal length. I think it's extremely versatile, and I also love wide aperture lenses. So this 1.2 is really exciting. It is the first Sony branded 1.2 maximum aperture lens. Sigma makes a 35 1.2 for Sony E-mount system, and that is a really cool, really fun lens. I did a couple reviews on it already. Feel free to check those out. But this is the first one Sony made, so I'm really excited about it. Just spoiler alert, right off the top, the things I love about it are its sharpness, its bokeh subject separation, and low light performance because of that 1.2 maximum aperture, and its autofocus is probably the best I have ever tested. Now the downsides are, it is pretty heavy for a prime lens, definitely not the heaviest I've ever tested. But it is still pretty heavy and pretty front heavy on Sony mirrorless cameras. That's just kind of to be expected at this point now though. And it is also really expensive at $2,000 US. But anyway, now that you've got the overview, let's jump into all the details and really put this lens to the test. All right, so first let's talk about the build quality. This is an extremely well-constructed lens, as you'd come to expect from a Sony G Master lens. It is a mostly magnesium alloy build, which cuts down on the weight a little bit, but it is still 1.7 pounds or 778 grams. So for a prime lens, it is a bit on the heavier side. This lens has a 72mm filter thread for those UV filters, the polarizers, and the ND filters if you want to use any of those. It is fairly front heavy on full frame bodies, and it is extremely front heavy on APS-C bodies, but like I said earlier, that's just something we've come to expect from the Sony mirrorless system. Now moving on to the features of this lens. The focus ring is rubberized and it feels really nice in the hand. It has a good amount of resistance. It's not quite as tight as I would like, but it is also focused by wire, which if you've watched any of my other videos is not my preference, but it seems like most of these Sony lenses are focused by wire. The only one I know of that's not is the G Master 70-200 2.8. If any of you know any other full-time manual focus lenses, please leave that in the comments below. Next up is the manual aperture ring. Now, this ring I've noticed is a little bit controversial. Everybody either loves it or hates it. I have grown to actually really like it. I like having one fewer things to mess with on the back of the camera. I like being able to just take my left hand and turn the ring, but I totally understand why some people find this totally unnecessary and maybe even a little annoying. Now this ring goes from f1.2 in thirds of stops to f16 with an additional click for auto if you just want to leave it in auto and control it on the back of your camera. Now in addition to the manual aperture ring, it has the option to declick the aperture so that it doesn't stop on those perfect thirds. Next, it has an autofocus manual focus switch, which surprisingly some of even the higher end lenses for the Sony mirrorless system don't have. So it is nice to see it on here, but honestly I would be surprised if it didn't. And finally, it has two customizable focus lock buttons. I personally never set mine to do anything. In fact, sometimes I accidentally touch one and I'm like, why isn't the camera autofocusing on what I'm telling it to? And sure enough, it's because I'm accidentally pressing one of these buttons. But if you are someone who likes using them, then there are two of them, so that can be a great benefit for you. Finally, on the topic of the body, this is moisture and dust resistant. It has a fluorine coating on the front element to reduce dust and fingerprints, and it does have a rubber gasket in the back. The buttons and the rings on the body are also fully weather sealed. I have personally not had the opportunity to take this lens out in the rain yet. I probably wouldn't anyway, just to be safe. But if you do end up in that situation, you can at least rest assured that it is mostly protected. Now let's talk about image quality. This lens is incredibly sharp. I think it's the sharpest lens I have ever tested for the Sony system. I said that about the Sony Zeiss 50mm 1.4, and that was probably true at the time, but now that I have my hands on this lens, I think this lens is definitely the winner. It has 14 elements in 10 groups, including 3 extreme spherical elements for extreme sharpness. This lens also handles ghosting and flaring quite well with a nano anti-reflective coating. Now, what I'm sure you've all been waiting for, let's talk about the bokeh. At 1.2, the bokeh is extremely soft. It's extremely creamy and buttery, all the great things that people love to say about fast aperture lenses. This lens absolutely delivers. Additionally, even towards the corners, there's surprisingly little cat eye distortion. That's when bokeh towards the edges of the frame starts to look like a little bit ovular, like a cat's eyes. This lens does really well at that. It has an 11 bladed aperture, so even as you start to stop down, the bokeh stays incredibly round. Additionally, the low light performance is really great. When I switch between this lens and some of my 2.8 or f4 zoom lenses, it's really nice to be able to crank the ISO back down for less noise. Even in really low lit weddings, I can stay within a really nice clean ISO range when I shoot at 1.2 because I have that extra low light performance coming from the aperture. Absolutely love that for most of the types of events I shoot. Now, even if you're shooting portraits with plenty of light, this still gives you really nice shallow depth of field for those really creamy out of focus backgrounds. Definitely a huge plus of this lens. Another place this lens really excels at is autofocus in both photo and video modes. It has 4 XD extreme dynamic linear motors. What a cool name, right? For some very fast and very accurate autofocus, especially if you have one of the newer Sony bodies that does the eye detect autofocus or even the eye detect autofocus while shooting video. It stays on the eyes, it finds the faces, it stays on your focus point, it snaps to focus really quickly. I've been incredibly impressed with this lens. Now, speaking of focus, it does have a slightly disappointing minimum focusing distance of 16 inches or about 40 centimeters. Really, that's not too bad. This lens is not a macro lens. It's not meant to be a macro lens, but some 50mm lenses do have a slightly better minimum focusing distance. So if you want to use this lens for product photography, for example, it might not be the right choice. All right, so now that we've hit the major points on this lens, let's compare it to some of its top competitors. I personally upgraded to this lens from the Sony Zeiss 50mm 1.4, which is an absolutely great lens. I have a couple reviews on that. Be sure to check those out. But I am an absolute bokeh-phile. I don't know if that's a real word, but I love bokeh. So when I heard that Sony was making a G Master 50mm 1.2, I absolutely had to get my hands on it. The Sony G Master is $500 more expensive at $2,000 US, whereas the Sony Zeiss 1.4 version of this lens is only about $1,500 US. I do think that the Sony G Master's performance is a little bit better in pretty much every regard, but is it worth that $500 to you? that's gonna have to be for you to decide. They are about the same size and about the same weight, so there's really no benefit there. So really it's just, are those minor performance improvements worth that $500 to you? If you're really just looking to get your hands on a 50mm of some kind, I would actually recommend the Sony 50mm 1.8. It is only $250. It is less of a professional lens if you're just a hobbyist. It works really well. The autofocus is really snappy. It is still fairly sharp, but it is only $250 US. It is also only 0.41 pounds or 186 grams. So it's a lot smaller, a lot lighter, and a lot more affordable. Now you're not gonna get that pro performance out of it, but it still works great, perfectly good for most people. All right, so just to wrap up, I absolutely love this lens. The sharpness, the bokeh and low light performance, the autofocus have all been incredible to use since I got this lens. But at that $2,000 price point, it may be a little too expensive for what most people need. Thankfully, you've got plenty of other options in the 50mm focal length. So decide for yourself whether or not that's worth it to you. And as always, please be sure to like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.